All right, thank you. Well, good evening, everyone. Can everybody hear me all right? Yes. Solid. I don't think that this literally isn't on in this case, but that's fine. So I don't like using technology if I don't have to. So I'm so excited to see all of you in person. I know I've spoken for Livonia several times. I know there's some familiar faces in the crowd, but it's great to be here in person and see so many people who have come out, braved the elements, and arrived to hear about one of my favorite topics, and I imagine it's one of your favorites as well. So how many of you, this has got to be a pretty self-selecting audience, right? How many of you have ever been to a lighthouse? Right? So like not nary a hand not raised in the room. We've all been to one. Michigan has more lighthouses than any other state. There's something that I find vastly interesting. I sit actually on the board of the Michigan Lighthouse Alliance. My wife is actually a lighthouse keeper. In fact, this is her lighthouse, so I'd kind of be remiss if it didn't get, the front and center on kind of our opening screen here. But lighthouses are something that have interested me for a long time, and the more I read about them, the more I studied them, there were some really interesting stories. So a brief disclaimer before we start, because I know some people already had some questions for me at the very beginning. As I mentioned, Michigan has 129 lighthouses. Generally, when a library books me to speak, they look for about an hour. That's about the endurance level of the human butt. It's what we can kind of handle in a presentation. So that would equal less than 30 seconds if I had to talk about every lighthouse. And that doesn't do any of them justice. So I promise I did not exclude any lighthouses on purpose. If your favorite isn't mentioned, it's not because I dislike it or anything like that. I had to kind of pick and choose. So what I did is I picked the ones, that I knew about, so I didn't have to make stuff up. And I picked lighthouses that I thought told compelling stories, interesting stories, told something that could be kind of universal about lighthouses. We've got a little bit about lighthouse technology that all of the lighthouses around Michigan use. And then we'll kind of end things tonight with a look at some lighthouse superlatives. That's always kind of, a favorite, shortest, tallest, oldest, that sort of thing. So I guess without too much more ado, I've got my clicker here. Oops. And we will jump right in. So lighthouses are something that go back a long way. This is, an artist's depiction of the lighthouse at Alexandria, kind of one of those 7 wonders of the ancient world. So people have long been fascinated by lighthouses. This is one that we don't know exactly what it looked like, but suffice to say, lighthouses, again, a self-selecting crowd. I don't need to tell everyone here what a lighthouse does, but just to review, it's a marker at night for sailing vessels and for later, steam-powered vessels, so they can see where they're going. They can hopefully avoid shoals, dangerous ground, that sort of thing, find safe harbor. So for millennia, a lighthouse has kind of been a symbol of a source of hope for sailors, mariners, the world around. Now, for a very long time, lighthouses were very limited. Most people just chose, as much as you could, don't sail at night. Lay anchor, wait till you can see where you're going. Without artificial sources of illumination, it really takes literally a wonder of the ancient world to be big enough to be useful. So you go all through the Middle Ages, you might rely on seeing a fire in town or something like that. But people, organizations, state apparatus don't have enough money to put towards these things. So it's not until actually you get into kind of the modern era that you see lighthouses. This is one of my favorites. This is actually the Eddystone light. This is a lighthouse over in England. It kind of marks the beginnings of modern lighthouse construction, built in the 1690s, and they really didn't have a great model to go on. Today, when you think of a lighthouse, a lot of us probably have, an image in mind. Some of us might think of like a Thomas Kincaid painting or something like that. But, when he's building this in the 1690s, it has all sorts of goofy stuff. There's candles up at the top. There's big rotating hooks that come down. This thing lasted all of about 2 years before it blew down in a storm. They replaced it with a newer light here, the Eddystone light, which really became the prototype for a lot of the lights you're going to see around the world and a lot of the lights here on the Great Lakes. And in fact, the Eddystone light is actually still there, kind of. So you can actually see the original light fell over in a storm. But you can see these very dangerous rocks. These are off the south coast of England. This is the more modern light that was built in the 1880s. And in fact, they made it even easier to get to because they put a helipad on top. Not something that was in the original 1880s design. But this gives us kind of a template to look at for lighthouses. And what I want to do is talk about some of that lighthouse technology that all of these lighthouses across the Great Lake share in common. So we think about a lighthouse. The number one piece of technology is right there in the name. It's a light. Like, that's why they call it a lighthouse. So you go back to the earliest times, your source of light, it's going to be fire, right? That's where you're going to get your illumination. And that's what we see is another different artist's conception of that lighthouse at Alexandria. They're literally building a giant pile of wood, dousing it with oil, burning it, and some poor laborer, maybe he's off the duty from pyramid duty, he has to haul that firewood all the way to the top of that lighthouse every night and build that. It's a very resource-intensive project. So right away, people said, well, how can we make this easier? Even if we can't have an improved source of light, there's got to be a way to make it brighter. And that's where we use mirrors. So how many of you have a mirror in your house? Maybe like your living room, something like that. So I'm not talking about like the mirror in your bathroom you use, but the mirror, like if you hang one up in your living room, what's it make your room look like? Bigger, lighter. It bounces the light in the room. That concept has been known for a really long time. So even if you just put a flat mirror behind a light source, it tends to bounce a lot of that light around, and some of it will go back out in the direction you want it to go, straight out towards the horizon so ships can see you. It wasn't too much longer they discovered, if you have a sphere, you take a slice of a sphere out, it will again bounce a little bit more light out in the direction you want to go. Now some of it's going up and down. The big breakthrough was they discovered the parabola. So that parabolic shape gets a lot of that light going, as you can see with these arrows, all in the same direction. And that's really what you want. This is kind of a breakthrough they have in the 18th century, so the 1700s. Now the guy I want to talk about, I don't like to use a ton of names and dates because people tend to forget those unless you are like super into this or maybe already knew it. But there are a couple names I want to throw at you because they're pretty important and they're interesting guys. This is Winslow Lewis. So Winslow Lewis actually invented the Lewis lamp. It was a modification of something called an argon burner, but it uses that parabola that we saw, that principle of bouncing a lot of the light back into the same direction. And he actually took a lot of these. This is a patent from about 1810 or so, and this is what patents looked like back then. And he put them kind of almost looks like a Christmas tree stand, and you'd have a number of these facing kind of all directions. You light it up, and you are able to spread the light power of several of those lamps, amplifies them significantly. So that's his patent. This is a closer look at what one of those lamps would look like. You've got your big parabola back here. You've got your light source, so there's a big wick in there, just like if you've ever used one of those kerosene lamps at home, you've got a wick. And then your fuel source behind it. Here's another period drawing to give you an idea of what it looked like. One of Lewis's big innovations was actually using a big lens in front of it, almost like a magnifying glass. That again, you put the magnifying glass in front of the light, the dish behind it. You're really trying to get as much use as you can out of this little tiny flame in here. And the wick is an interesting thing. There's a lot of development in wick technology. They discover, flat wick burns pretty well, but eventually they discover if you have a round wick. Now, how many of you have ever used one of those kerosene lamps at home? Sometimes you see them like the old-timey store, or you've got like the kerosene in the bottom and a little knob that makes the wick go up and down. So what happens to the glass above the wick? It gets dark, it gets sooty, it gets smoky. They're dirty no matter what you burn, especially the kind of fuels they're using. So they found a circular wick produced less soot. So that's one of the other innovations you see here. Here's kind of a bit of a more modern drawing to give you an idea of what that looked like. That was one of those lamps that you'd have in a big stand. And here's a picture of what that lens actually looked like. Now I mentioned the fuel. There's a number of things you can burn in one of those lamps. Today we think about a kerosene lamp as kind of being the most common. You go and you get your fuel. But back in the 18-teens, the 1820s, all the way up until really the 1850s and 60s, anybody have an idea what kind of fuel were they using? Whale oil. So it is actually very, very expensive. You read those stories about Captain Ahab going out there. Well, why is he doing this incredibly dangerous thing? To go out and hunt whales? It's because they can render all of that blubber and turn it into whale oil, and that's what they're using. So very, very expensive stuff, and this is actually pretty important. So just stick that little factoid in the back of your mind. Next guy I want to talk about, and all of these threads will come back together, I promise. There's a guy named Stephen Pleasanton. As you can see, he is, last name very deserved there, very pleasant-looking man. This is actually the only known photo of him, so if you ever look him up, this is the picture you're going to see. He worked for the Department of the Treasury. He was the 5th auditor of the United States. That doesn't mean that there were 4 auditors before him and he was like number 5. That was his job title. There was the 2nd auditor, the 3rd auditor, the 4th auditor, the 5th auditor, and so on down the Treasury Department. And so he was actually like the 7th or 8th, 5th auditor of the United States. He worked for the Treasury Department. As a brief aside, the lighthouses fall under a number of different federal departments at different times. When the country is starting out back in the 1780s, there are a few lighthouses out on the East Coast. Excuse me. And you got to figure a place to put them. Who's going to administer them? Well, if you think back to George Washington's presidency, he only has 3 members in his cabinet. So he has 3 federal departments, obviously a lot smaller than today. He's got the Secretary of War. He has the Secretary of State, and of course war deals with war. Secretary of State deals with our relations with other countries, and the Secretary of the Treasury. Well, lighthouses aren't particularly, offensive in nature. They're not something in another country, so they just get stuck under the Treasury Department. It's really the only one left. Later on, the Treasury Department kind of spins it off into the United States Lighthouse Establishment, becomes the United States Lighthouse Service, and of course by the 1930s it becomes part of the United States Coast Guard. So those are all names you will see about lighthouses here in Michigan, different groups that have run them over the time. So Stephen Pleasanton works for the Treasury. Now, this is kind of important because he is very bad at his job. I know this will surprise all of you that someone who was maybe kind of incompetent wound up in the federal government. But he works his way up there, and the way he gets there I think is fascinating. You've probably all seen this painting before. I also vow to you, I'm not going to ask you guys any trick questions. What are they doing in this picture? What are they signing? This is the Declaration of Independence. Pretty important document in American history. You jump forward until the War of 1812. During that war, rather famously, the British show up and they burn down Washington, D.C. There's this great big battle. It could be its own whole presentation, which would be pretty fun, but there's a battle outside of Washington, D.C. The American forces run away almost immediately. The city's undefended, and people are fleeing Washington, D.C. because they know the British are going to be here any minute. We have to get out of town. Dolly Madison famously saves, a big portrait of George Washington. People are leaving. Well, Stephen Pleasanton was this, at the time he was a clerk working in the State Department, and he's in the big office building that has the State Department and the Treasury Department, and everyone's grabbing their papers and leaving and saying I don't think we're going to be back tomorrow. This building might not be here. Get out of town. Well, as he's walking out of the building, he notices hanging on the wall in a frame is the Declaration of Independence. And he says, oh, yeah, someone might want to take that with us. If the British get a hold of that, they might, write void on it or something. That's something that they would really like to get their hands on. So Stephen Pleasanton gets up on a chair, rips it off the wall, and carries it with him out of Washington, D.C. Turns out he rode the high of that for the rest of his life. He kind of parlayed that into a lot of success, and then he became a mid-level bureaucrat. So this is a very good depiction of what Stephen Pleasanton was like. He liked to work in the deep bowels of a building, and but he told everyone I saved the Declaration of Independence. I should get this job. And so important guy. So that's how he gets this job as the 5th auditor. He had never been to sea. He was not a sailor. He probably never even saw a lighthouse before he got the job of being the administrator of all lighthouses in the United States. All right, so here's the 3rd thread we're going to have to weave together for this story. Keep those previous 2 threads together. The other thing about Stephen Pleasanton, we'll get to this when we weave the 3 of them together. Now, there is another part of the world besides the United States. So I want to take you to this country here, France. At the same time, the 1820s and 30s, this guy, Augustin Fresnel, this is a name, if you guys are lighthouse enthusiasts, how many of you have ever heard of Fresnel? How many of you cringe when you hear somebody say Fresnel? Right? This is fingers on the chalkboard. He's French. It's Fresnel, not Fresnel. So Fresnel is a scientist working in France, and he discovers something amazing. No, it is not the opening to a Looney Tunes cartoon. I know that's what this looks like, but this is actually a pretty amazing piece of science. At the time, in the 1820s, Fresnel was working with optics and light, and he had a pretty wild theory. He thought that light could work like a wave, And prior to him, for the last few hundred years, everyone had deferred to this guy, Sir Isaac Newton, who was pretty smart. And Isaac Newton had said, light works like a particle. Well, there was kind of no real good way to test this. Eventually, though, they did find a setup, Arago. So this is another experiment that was kind of set up as first a thought experiment and then real life. You have a light source. You can put an opaque object in front of it, and if you position it just so, if light truly does act like a wave, it will actually bend around that solid piece, and you don't have to be a physicist to get all this, but just know that if this were true, you would wind up with a tiny spot of light in the middle of what should otherwise be a dark disk, just like this. So that little tiny dot of light in the center of that, this picture is a more modern picture, shows that some of that light is getting around a solid object. And if it's a particle traveling a straight line, it can't do it. If it's a wave that can be bent, it can. Later on, they kind of question if it's a particle or a wave. There's a lot more experiments that go on with it. But suffice to say, this is a pretty major breakthrough. So what they discovered is they could bend light. They could find a way to force light, just like Isaac Newton did in his prism there. There's other ways they could do it. So what Fresnel does is he builds a series of lenses, just like this. They're one big circle. He discovers they're a very powerful way of focusing a lot of light onto a single point. And eventually he takes this concept and he says this is a great way, a great application for this would be for something like a lighthouse. So you take a lot of these small prisms and lenses, bend them so that you're getting all of that light going in the same direction. Just like that picture we looked at early on, this is one of the most efficient ways to do that. In fact, you guys are looking at the result of a Fresnel lens that's in that projector right now. How many of you drove here tonight? Or rode in a car, right? So even if you didn't drive, you benefited because like your headlights, your taillights, those are Fresnel lenses. This concept is still with us 200 years on. So Fresnel mocks up his initial lens. He actually takes it up to this building, the Arc de Triomphe, which was still under construction at the time in the 1820s. He goes up to the top. It's the tallest building in Paris. And Louis XVIII, he is briefly King of France in the 1820s. He is out at his estate at Versailles, and he is something like 12 miles away. And one night when he's partying, doing the kinds of things kings of France do, one of his aides says, Monsieur, if you would please look back at Paris, we've arranged for a special scientific demonstration. If you just turn your head to the left, you will notice that there is a light coming from Paris, like 12 miles away that you can see. He turns, he sees it, and lo and behold, it is that single lantern that Fresnel has on top of the Arc de Triomphe. And it was pretty amazing. The king said that it is amazing. You can amplify light to that degree. Let's fund this guy's research. And so they put it to practical use. This is a lighthouse at a place called Cordovan. That is in like the Bay of Biscay. It's down here by Bordeaux. There's a little island right there. This is a huge lighthouse, to give you an idea. There's a guy standing on it, so if that gives you an indication of how big of a lens. But this was the real practical purpose. I know this is a tangent, but I couldn't help but show you guys. You must all be lighthouse enthusiasts. This is what the inside of this lighthouse looks like. They built this for a king. It's made out of marble. It has marble floors. There's actually a chapel inside because they had this kind of strange idea that the king might come visit them at their lighthouse and stay, so they had to have a chapel so the king could attend church services. Pretty ornate building. But a huge success. This proves very popular. Sailors see this. In fact, to this day, at the base of every lighthouse in the country of France, there's a statue of Augustin Fresnel. Unfortunately, Fresnel, he dies in his 30s from tuberculosis, so he dies young. It's one of those what-ifs of what he might have accomplished. But this takes off like wildfire. All throughout Europe, people begin using these Fresnel lenses. The Fresnel lenses kind of look like this. This is actually a later picture of the US. They don't catch on in the United States for basically a few decades. Now let's tie these threads together, those people we talked about. Stephen Pleasanton, the man who knows nothing about lighthouses, he starts getting reports from sailors, because sailors obviously are going to other countries and coming back, and they're like, how come we can see all the lighthouses in France great, and when we get back to the United States, it's terrible? And they're complaining, so we should get the same lights they have in Europe. And Fresnel, Pleasanton says, nah, it's too expensive to buy those. He has a deal with Winslow Lewis. Winslow Lewis is that man who invented that lamp that he is selling to the federal government. Not only is he selling that lamp, he has secured the contract to also deliver the oil, which I have to imagine is a bit of a conflict of interest, because he didn't really have any kind of incentive to find something that burned more efficiently, because if you're selling somebody the car and the gas, you don't really care what kind of mileage it gets. And this is what happens. Stephen Pleasanton for decades says, well, it's cheaper setup for those Lewis lamps, even though over the long term they work worse and they are more expensive in terms of fuel. In fact, if you make the upfront investment into something like a Fresnel lens like this, they're very efficient in terms of the fuel you burn. So it actually eventually comes to a congressional hearing in the 1850s when they're finally able to oust Pleasanton after decades, and the United States gets Fresnel lenses just like these. They are arranged in order from first order all the way down to sixth order. So sixth order lenses are like this. First order lenses like barely fit on this stage. They are huge, very impressive if you ever get a chance to see one. There are some that are even custom built. This is one out in Hawaii that you can see. Massive, massive lens. So we have talked a little bit about lighthouse technology. Let's get on to how this applies to Michigan. That is what this is kind of all about after all. Most lighthouses in Michigan were built with that Fresnel lens technology. Any of the ones that were built after the 1850s, and of course the ones that were built before that were modified to use it. So in Michigan, there's a huge need for lighthouses. If you think about Michigan, the Anishinaabe, the indigenous people of Michigan have lived here since time immemorial, and they get around by water. It's kind of a no-brainer in Michigan with the number of rivers and lakes. It's the best way to get around. But obviously, if you are in a birch bark canoe and you can kind of pop up on land wherever you want, you're probably rarely out of sight of the land. The Odawa are kind of known as like, they're the very brave ones who will occasionally go out of the sight of land on their canoes, you know, take a big risk and cut across one of the lakes. But very rarely are you even out of the sight of land, and you can pull up. There's no need for a lighthouse. Lighthouse is really for a ship that requires a harbor somewhere so they don't ground out when they're coming up. The canoes become bigger after Europeans arrive in the 16th century. This is a canoe de maitre. It's about 40 feet long. You can haul 3 tons of goods. They took this indigenous technology. They said it works great. Let's make it bigger. Sailing does come pretty early to Michigan, too. This is I guess, an idea of what Le Griffin looks like. This is the first sailing vessel on the Great Lakes, 1679. Pro tip, every year, like clockwork, you will see a story that someone has definitely found it this time. No, they haven't. I'm just going to save you time right now. I hate to disappoint anyone. They're not going to find it. It's completely gone. But every year, you're going to see somebody. I hope I get to eat my words someday. But this was the first sailing vessel. It actually sank on its inaugural sail in 1679. But sailing came on the Great Lakes. The real big thing comes in the 1820s. By the 1820s, you have the advent of not only steam power, so this is Walk in the Water, the first steam vessel on the Great Lakes. You have the completion of the Erie Canal. So now ships can come all the way up from New York, get onto the Great Lakes, come back out, trade in cruise booms. Michigan very quickly, becomes a state not too long afterwards. And you see with the huge boom in shipbuilding, there is an immediate cry saying, we need more lighthouses in the state. If you're going to have hundreds of ships, if not thousands operating, we need lighthouses to operate here safely. So that's how the proliferation of these lighthouses really start at about that time. This is a great postcard I scanned and kind of blew up here. I know it's maybe a little blurry on the stage, but you can all recognize the state, and you can all recognize just the sheer number of lighthouses all around our coastlines. We have more than any other state, which is, I think, really cool. I think sometimes the coastal elites will think about their very tall lighthouses and forget that Michigan has so many here on the Great Lakes. I know the tall lighthouse comes up a lot. It's kind of an interesting thing. One of the reasons you think about a height for a lighthouse, the ocean is a little bit different than the Great Lakes. Both are obviously massive, bodies of water, but on the ocean, there's a very gentle slope in most places out towards the end of kind of the continental shelf. So a lot of large ships are going to be much further away from shore because it's so shallow for such a long time. I know some people go to the ocean and you can walk a couple hundred yards out and still be like only up to your waist if it's a really, shallow place. How many of you have gone swimming in, one of the Great Lakes? You come up to, Lake Huron and you go out 300 yards, it's going to be like 200 feet deep. It's very, very sharp decline. So as a result, on the oceans, the ships are further away from shore, so the lighthouses are taller. On the Great Lakes, the ships are quite frequently closer to shore, so the lighthouses don't have to be built as tall. So that's one of the big differences. And it wasn't actually until a recent trip that I made to St. Augustine before I was kind of able to put all that together in my mind. I just thought like, well, ocean's bigger, taller lighthouse, but it actually has nothing to do with the size, because with both the ocean and the Great Lakes, you can only see the lights so many miles out to sea. It doesn't really matter how big the entire body of water is. All right, so the first lighthouse I want to talk about is actually the first lighthouse in the state of Michigan. It is Fort Gratiot Light. So Fort Gratiot was actually built by Winslow Lewis, that name I told you about. So not only does he get the contract to build lenses and supply fuel, he also frequently gets contracts from Stephen Pleasanton to build lighthouses. And he's pretty bad at it. The first lighthouse he builds in Port Huron in 1825, what would become Port Huron, only stays up for about 4 years before it blows down in a storm. It was also so poorly situated that sailors said they could not see the light until they had already entered the St. Clair River from Lake Huron, which kind of rendered the whole thing pointless. So when they rebuild the light, they actually re-site it. Congress allocates about $5,000 to build this. There's a lot of money in the 1820s, and so since 1829, we've had the Fort Gratiot Light. And here you can see this is Lake Huron right here. There's the Blue Water Bridge, and there is the St. Clair River, very, very fast river. But been a popular place for people to visit for many, many years. We'll quickly see some lighthouses are probably a better lighthouse to be stationed at than others. I would put the Fort Gratiot Light pretty high on the list of nice places that you would want to be stationed if you were a lighthouse keeper. In fact, it's kind of funny, in the rules to lighthouse keepers that comes out by the 1880s, in fact, you were required, and this was true of all lighthouses in Michigan, all lighthouses across the United States, you were required to be kind and courteous to all visitors to the lighthouse and show them around when they showed up. So that was one of the jobs of the lighthouse keeper. So we can see there's the early duplex. We know that the federal government not only builds these towers, they also build the place for the people to live. You know, in 1829, there was really no city of Port Huron at the time. There was no great place for a keeper to live, so they get a house. And you'll notice the house is detached. That's one of the other things you can tell about a lighthouse in Michigan, a quick way to judge its age. If the dwelling of the lighthouse is detached, it's more likely to be an earlier lighthouse. And think about it from Congress's perspective. They said, you know, if we hire some lighthouse keeper and he, you know, forgets that he put bacon on the stove and he burns his house down, we really don't want to lose our $5,000 investment in that tower. So separate the house, because we don't care if his house burns down ultimately, like he could live in a tent, but don't let him burn that tower down. That was very expensive to build and engineer. So you will see separate housing quarters from the actual tower itself. That's what you see here in the 1870s as well, a duplex. Another building that is common to many lighthouses across the state is a fog signal station. How many of you have ever experienced fog on the Great Lakes? Pretty common. That can happen one way or another. You can have the brightest light in the whole country, but if there's dense fog and you can only have 20 foot of visibility, well, that's not going to do you any good. So fog signals were popular. The earliest fog signals were simply things like a bell. There were a couple lighthouses that even used like a cannon they would set off every couple minutes. It sounds fun, but there was frequently a bell that you might hit with a hammer every 30 seconds. When we get field trips that come visit the lighthouse, I tell them that and I ask the kids, who here wants to hit this bell as hard as you can with a hammer every 30 seconds? They're very excited until I tell them, like, okay, well, you have to keep doing it for as long as the fog's around, which could be a couple hours. And enthusiasm tends to wane a little bit after that. The fog signal building here, you can actually see has a really tall smokestack. That's usually how you could tell a fog signal station. And it's because a lot of them used steam power. So they would have a boiler, they would build a fire, build up the steam to run air whistles, so steam whistles. Steam whistles sound like when Fred Flintstone gets out of work, the big whistle the guy pulls. That's what they would blow, every 30 seconds, something like that. Eventually, there was a problem. Fog can come and go so quickly that it sometimes was impossible to build up steam by the time the fog has arrived, and by the time you have the steam, the fog's gone. So I eventually switched to compressed air. This is a photo from the 1930s. Many of these were standard equipment across the Great Lakes. They would have small engines running an air compressor, and they would use compressed air to blow the horns. They eventually switched to a diaphone, which is a sound you have all heard as well. They go from the steam whistle to the diaphone, the two different tones. It's great at setting the scene when you go down to the docks, you're investigating a crime. There's always one of those going off in the background, right? So the fog signal, this is an example of one of those steam whistles and air diaphone systems. Just a picture, again, of kind of the whole complex there. So most of these lighthouses, sometimes we think of a lighthouse, are actually quite a bit more than a lighthouse. They're an entire light station. One more quick aside about the Fort Gratiot Light, because it is my favorite, and I wrote the presentation, so I got to pick what to talk about. It has a green light. This is very uncommon. Most lights are either white or red. Those are the two colors that you can see the furthest away. But there are rare instances where you might use a green light. One of those instances are in a place where you have a lot of lighthouses in a very close proximity. Great example is like the Straits of Mackinac, where you have over a dozen lighthouses within a 20-mile circle because there are so many inlets and places to put them. Every lighthouse needs to look unique in both a day marking, so when you see it, you know which one you're looking at, and they also have to have a unique light signature. So that's the type of light that's going to maybe flash once every 6 seconds, or it'll flash twice and then be off for 10 seconds. Or maybe it's a continuous sweep. That's kind of a famous one that's always on and sweeping. But you want to be able to look and tell at night. If there's a bunch of lighthouses you can see on the horizon, it'd be very confusing if they all had the same light signature and you couldn't tell one from another. The other reason you might wind up with a green one, so you could use green to differentiate it. In Port Huron, you can see in the background here, there's a great big water tower, some heavy industry. There's a paper company that actually just went out of business a couple weeks ago, nearly 100 years old, called Dunn Paper. And they had a rail spur that came to pick up the paper. And even back in the 1930s, when they electrified the light at Fort Gratiot, sailors said, well, when we're looking in that direction, right behind the lighthouse is this paper factory. If the train comes in, it's got a bright headlight. And then all of a sudden, we don't know which one's the lighthouse, which one's the headlight, and the headlight's moving, and you're bobbing up and down on a boat. You don't want to be trying to figure out which one of these is actually the lighthouse. So they eventually said, all right, trains don't use a green light because they have the red light on the caboose. We'll put a green light on the Fort Gratiot station. So it has a green lantern, which is pretty cool. Small plug, if anybody does want to come spend an overnight at the light, it's pretty fun. So moving down the river just a little bit, there's another type of light that I want to talk about, that there is another great example in Port Huron nearby, and it's a range light. These are also pretty common. Sometimes you see a range light. The way a range light works, so there's actually two of them. There's one here, and there's one back there. Sometimes these were not even manned. Sometimes they're like this. They're simply, kind of reflectors. These are automated. These were actually built in the 90s. They're really nice because they kind of match like the condos that were developed here. Before this, they were much more industrial, just like metal posts. But the way a range light works, if you are coming into a river that moves around a lot and you need to line up your 1,000-foot freighter to make sure you're entering this curvy river at the right angle, you use these just like the sights on a rifle. So this one in the back is actually taller than the one in the front. You wait until they are lined up. Once they are both in a line, you know you're on the right angle of approach. So there are actually range lights all over the state as well. The St. Clair River, for instance, requires a pilot, as does much of the Detroit River. There are so many twists and turns. So they will run pilot boats out to those freighters to navigate those, and they know all about these range lights and how to look. Another kind of lighthouse that's kind of unique to Michigan, the Huron. Has anyone here ever seen the Huron or been on board? So the Huron is actually a light ship. There are places in the Great Lakes and on the eastern coast, although they were actually more common on the Great Lakes, where it was not economical or very difficult, or there were engineering challenges in building an actual permanent lighthouse. And so what they do is they stick a lighthouse on a boat, and you sail the boat out to wherever the danger is, you mark it, and you just anchor it there for the whole shipping season. So for example, the Huron here marked the Corsica shoals, which were just underwater. So the big freighters would definitely run into them, but they are invisible above the water. This would sit on the edge of where those shoals were and guide the ships around it. They're called the Corsica shoals. There's a bit of a seafaring tradition. If you were a seafaring captain back in the wooden ship days, you're sailing along and all of a sudden you just hear like crunch, crack, and you've hit one of these shoals and there's a huge hole in your boat. Now you're going down and you get on the lifeboat and you had no idea you were going to hit that. And you're sitting there in the lifeboat shivering and cold. You have one thing that will probably warm your mind, and that's the fact that they're going to name the shoals after the ship you just sunk. So that's the silver lining. The Corsica was the first ship to hit the Corsica shoals. So sometimes if you see weird names, that's why. So the Huron worked until 1970, amazingly late. It was the last light ship on the Great Lakes. It's kind of crazy to think that just a little over 50 years ago, it was still more economical to send 6 guys out on a little boat for 9 months out of the year to just warn people like, watch out, please watch out, please watch out, please watch out on this boat. Very boring work, by the way. This boat's only 92 feet long, but it's now anchored as a museum ship in Port Huron. And there's the light itself. You can see it all the way up here. All right, so this is, how many of you have seen this movie? Like 2 of you. I'm going to recommend it, okay? And please, don't blame me if you watch it and hate it. But This is actually kind of a psychological horror thriller movie. There's not a lot of jump scares. It's not, like anything like that. It's more about the experience of like two men living on a tiny island with a lighthouse, and one of them might be crazy. And it's kind of fun. I'll let you guess which one might be crazy. So this movie is called The Lighthouse, by the way. It came out just a few years ago. It's black and white, so it's kind of an art feeling to it. But it's a new movie. It's Robert Pattinson, and great movie. So what I think of with this is there's a lighthouse in Michigan, probably my second favorite lighthouse. It's a place called Stannard Rock. Stannard Rock is one of those lighthouses. If Port Huron's a nice place to be stationed, Stannard Rock is the worst place in the world to be stationed. Because if you actually look, so this is the Keweenaw Peninsula. Down here, there's Marquette. How many of you been up to the Keweenaw before? A few people? It's pretty remote. It's a long trip up there. Stannard Rock is actually like 30 miles north of Marquette, all the way up here. It is in the middle of nowhere. A lot of people have actually called it the most isolated place on Earth. It is certainly the most isolated place in the Western Hemisphere. The fact that when you get on this island, this little lighthouse that they have built, it's called a crib light. That's called the crib down there. You are out of the sight of land. You are like 30 miles from land. And even if you get to land, the 30 miles are very rural Keweenaw Peninsula. You're more likely to run into a bear than another person. So very, very remote. So this was one of those places that's maybe not pleasant to stay. You can see it's stacked. There are rooms right on top of each other. So your room, the living quarters were here in the middle. So even if you weren't actively working, the guys who were would be constantly walking through your room saying, oh, excuse me, just me, going back down to the kitchen, walking through your tiny little room. These are not very big. That's a picture of inside what this tiny tower would look like. And if you can imagine being there and the kinds of weather conditions you might experience at a place like Stannard Rock. There was one season, it was even in the 1920s, so relatively recent, only 100 years ago, where at the end of the season, the weather was so foul on Lake Superior, they couldn't get a boat out to them. And they got stuck for an additional 3 weeks. They almost ran out of food. And the Coast Guard knew, they're out there, we got to bring them in, and they have, they're down to their last, tin of beans, but we can't get a boat out to them. There's 30-foot waves. It's too dangerous. So that's the kind of conditions that they would live with. Not a pleasant place to go at all. It kind of maybe be cool to poke around for an hour or two, but there was a lot of stories of Coast Guardsmen who, if you decided to take this, it was manned until the 1960s, if you agreed to spend a season here, where you would hopefully spend, a few weeks on, go back, a few weeks off, because they would run mail and supplies out every couple weeks and rotate a crew member, that if you spent a season here, you got to pick where you could go the next season. Any station in the world for the Coast Guard. So there's a lot of guys who would risk it, especially, some young single men who would wind up here just because their next post could be Miami Beach, So I don't know if that's worth it. Maybe, you'd have to ask one of them. They did find ways to try and fight boredom. This is actually a U.S. Lighthouse Establishment Library. I always like to bring these up at a library because obviously self-selecting group, not only do you like lighthouses, you're here at a library, one of society's best institutions. So they bring a traveling library like this in a little pine box. It has a mix of books, comedy, science, religion, you name it. There was just a little bit of everything, and they would rotate these around throughout the year so you could always have something to read. I know some people, my wife included, she would love to actually just spend a summer with a box of a library on a little island and not talk to anyone else and just turn her books. So let's talk about another lighthouse over on the west side of the state. This is, anybody know? This is Big Red, pretty easy name to remember. This is actually in Holland. I got a chance to go here and take a few pictures. This was last year. Most people get pictures from the other side. It's actually hard to tell, but there's actually water out here. This is where the channel to go into Holland is. And this side is notoriously difficult to get to. There's a couple of giant mansions, and in fact, the day we went there, we got harassed by a security guard with a gun who was I think it was one of the DeVosses own a giant home there and don't want anyone walking by it, even though this is perfectly acceptable to go out to. We were having a meeting with the Lighthouse Alliance, lighthouse enthusiasts, and there's lawsuits ongoing. But so very lucky to get to actually see it in person and see it on this side. But this is actually a lighthouse where no one lives. So there was actually small workstations here, but the lighthouse keepers lived inland about a mile away or so. But another very iconic lighthouse. This is one that has a very iconic day mark. You can tell it instantly as a day mark. That's the color it is in the day. You can't mistake this for any other tower. This is actually a picture of my wife and I. Well, my wife, when we went there, was very excited to find lots of drawings of Fresnel lenses. They're like her favorite thing in the world. And I didn't even think about taking the pictures for the presentation, but you get what you get. So, and this is a picture of us up in the top at the lighthouse here. Yeah, you can see there's actually a little path here that totally takes you back to town until you run into the armed security guard right around that corner. He says, like, you're not allowed to go here. And we're like, this is a public sidewalk. And, you know, the guy with the gun wins. So, anyway, great example of one of those famous West Side lighthouses. All right, so I want to talk about another type of lighthouse. This is another crib light. This is Waugoshance, another one with a great day mark. It's got this red and white stripe. It's actually metal cladding. It was originally built with brick. They cladded it with metal because up in the Straits the winters are so harsh. And this has a fascinating story. So Waugoshance is sadly a lighthouse that became supplanted. White Shoal was built. That's the really famous one. We'll talk about that in a second. This one kind of became useless, and the federal government had something very interesting going on. World War II. During the Second World War, there's obviously a need to train all sorts of sailors, aviators, the like. So they actually commissioned a couple of aircraft carriers right here on the Great Lakes to train pilots. A lot easier to train them in the Great Lakes where, you know, they're really at no risk besides, you know, like crashing, but they're not going to crash in enemy territory or out in the ocean or something like that. You're on the lakes. So with the Sable and the Wolverine, they had aircraft carriers. They were training naval pilots, guys, bombers like this. There's actually some pretty famous people trained here. Anybody recognize this guy? That is George H.W. Bush, was a naval pilot who trained on the Great Lakes here. So one of the things they did, though, is they would take off from kind of the middle of Lake Michigan. They'd send these guys out. They've got to practice diving on targets, shooting torpedoes. A lot of dive bombers, they had to practice on a target. Well, the federal government now has to come up with a target for these guys to dive bomb on. They happen to own a number of these kind of small lighthouses that are now obsolete. They already own them as the federal government. And I know this is probably like very cringy as people who like lighthouses, but you can imagine the kinds of things they use as targets. So this is actually footage from a couple of these bombing runs that they used Waugoshance as their target. So the lighthouse was bombed out. It's kind of cool. They actually were testing drones during the Second World War. We think of that as a very modern thing, but they had some drone testing as well during the war. You can see one of the drones up front, and this is the chase plane. But a great example of that lighthouse. And guys would practice strafing runs. They'd machine gun it. They'd bomb it. And as a result, for as nice and picturesque as things like Big Red are, Waugoshance doesn't look so nice anymore. So this is what Waugoshance looks like. I know it's very sad, and I guarantee you this is on, if there was an endangered species list for lighthouses, this has got to be the top of the list because Waugoshance has been neglected, it's been bombed out, it's hard to get to. It basically can never be refurbished, because if it looks bad here, look at the other side. You're going to need more than J.B. Weld to hold this thing together. It's gone. And so it's probably going to collapse sometime. Could be next year, could be 5 years, could be 10. Hard saying exactly. You can see a lot of the birds like it. So that's Waugoshance. We have some of these kind of almost ghosts of lighthouses past. So if we look up into the Straits, as I mentioned, there were lots and lots and lots of lighthouses in the Straits of Mackinac. So you can see why they'd all want to be different. The other one that made Waugoshance obsolete is White Shoal. So built in 1910, 121 feet tall there. Very iconic candy cane stripe for its day mark. Very popular one. That one's actually under active restoration. So there's a group that, boy, as soon as they got White Shoal, they go to, we travel in the same circle, some of us lighthouse preservationists. And any event I've ever seen them at, they can stick out their palm and it gets filled with money for White Shoal very quickly because it is such an iconic lighthouse. People really like that one. It was on the license plates for a while. Anybody here have one of those lighthouse license plates? They're pretty cool. We actually got a huge grant we finished at the Fort Gratiot Light from those, so they're not a scam, and thank you. That grant money from the purchase of those license plates goes back into helping lighthouses just like this. Other lighthouses might be familiar with. This is actually the entrance light to Mackinac Island, and back there is the Round Island light, which is very ironically square. So that's the one Christopher Reeves looks out to and visits in Somewhere in Time. Anybody ever see that movie? It's a good one. Featured in there. There was like the St. Helena light. So St. Helena is this little island over here. It's about half the size of Mackinac Island, and there's no one on it. It is basically wilderness preserve. There is this lighthouse, and they have Boy Scout troops that go out there, and also sometimes lighthouse nerds like me take the girl they're dating at the time and say, hey, do you want to go check out an old lighthouse? And it was really fun. So we went over. Actually, you take one of the big Shepler boats, and then we eventually had to get into a little Zodiac like you were a Navy SEAL landing on the island. So very difficult to get to. So not visited. There's a great view of the Straits of Mackinac that not very many people see from the light there. There are places like Old Mackinac Point Light in Mackinac City. This is about as far as you can get from that. We got to build the tower separately from the home. By the 1890s, the home, the tower, they're all integrated, and it is a work of art. This place looks like a castle. This is, Norman Revival style lighthouse, which is pretty cool because the government goes from very utilitarian to that's a gorgeous building. I don't care who you are. It's really cool looking, no matter what you do. It was functional until November of 1957. Why would this one go out of commission? Anybody know?
The bridge was built.
They opened the Blue Water Bridge. They opened the Mackinac Bridge. You can tell them from Port Huron. They opened the Mackinac Bridge in 1957, and it made this lighthouse obsolete. There's plenty of lights on the bridge itself. So. But nice, you can still go see it as a museum. It's another example where it is, you can see the big tall building. This is the fog signal station, little workshop in the back. There are some families, like these are the Marshalls of Mackinac. If you get in, this is another whole aspect. It could be its own whole presentation, but there are some families that work lighthouses all over the state. The Marshalls are a great example. There are like dozens of them, and they're all lighthouse keepers, and they work at all of these different lighthouses across the straits. And they're pretty good at it. They got a lighthouse efficiency pennant there. All right, so I want to go up north. We're going up here to the Sioux. We've got, of course, the Sioux Locks, the St. Mary's. This is the lighthouse at Whitefish Point. And who here's been to Whitefish Point? Pretty cool, and they got a great big museum. A lot of people have been up there. My favorite story involves this guy named Robert and Anna Marie Carlson. Robert Carlson was the keeper there for about 35 years. He was the keeper there during World War I. And this is such a strange thing to think about, but during World War I, he asked to be reassigned in the winter. When the shipping season closed, there was nothing else left to do at the lighthouse. He said, I want to do my patriotic duty. This is from the winter of 1917 to 1918. He said, please reassign me. And they said, no, just watch the lighthouse. That's fine. And he said, okay. And they said, oh, by the way, we've got a new assistant keeper for you. And they drop off the assistant keeper. And Robert is immediately suspicious of this guy and his wife, that there's something off about them. And the guy eventually seems to, there are several nights in a row the next year where the new guy seems to forget to turn the light on. Well, that's not something a lighthouse keeper does. You literally have one job. You don't forget to turn the light on. Well, one night, finally, after basically snooping around for much of the spring, he basically catches this new keeper red-handed, catches him with like a box of dynamite in his quarters. Like, what are you doing? He informs the lighthouse service, and they said, all right, well, we're sending agents on the next resupply run. And they actually did their own research. They figured out this guy was a German spy. They arrested him. And he goes off kind of protesting, but they realized the jig was up because when they arrested the wife, she starts screaming at him in German. And they're like, yep. And you might think, why would you attack a lighthouse? But if you think about a great example, do you remember when that ship got caught in the Suez Canal? How bad that was for global trade? If you get a ship to wreck in the shipping lane of the Great Lakes, you could block so much traffic. And think of just how much material is coming on just one freighter. If you think it, how many guns could you make out of the metal that was on that freighter? That could be a huge boon for the Germans to disrupt the American war effort. In fact, this is not the only thing they tried. This is actually a tunnel underneath from Port Huron to Sarnia. There was an underwater train tunnel. And German agents in Port Huron, related to the guy up there, they actually had the most Looney Tunes plot I've ever seen. They strapped a bomb to a roller skate and got caught mounting this bomb on a roller skate to the train tracks to push it into the tunnel and blow it up. So there were German saboteurs active in Michigan to hit our pieces of infrastructure during the First World War. Pretty interesting. The one other thing that Whitefish Point, of course, is famous for is what shipwreck? The shipwreck, right? It's the one everyone knows. The lights went out at Whitefish Point. The generators were actually destroyed by flooding, and some people have said, well, that's what the Fitz couldn't find her way, could have maybe made it if she had been on a closer track, but the light was out. So they are still relevant even in the 70s. I'm friends with actually the director up at Whitefish Point, and I found this model, and sometimes he gets a little upset with some of the misconceptions, or a lot of people know a lot about the Fitz, and a lot of people think they know a lot about the Fitz and like to share with him. I found this model, and then I just sent him, I asked him, is this to scale? Was this where the Fitz sank? And he said, no, it wasn't 10 feet offshore. So, all right, so this is actually one of the biggest audiences that I've gotten a chance to present this to. So we have an excellent opportunity. This is the Round Island St. Mary's River, so there's a couple Round Islands. This is one up in the north. 1892 lighthouse, small, pretty conventional, house is built in. It's actually on a little island. Here's the thing about this lighthouse. It is for sale, okay? So the asking price is like 1.995 mil, so about $2 million. You get the whole island, you get the house, you can turn it into a B&B, you get the light. Now what I'm saying is, I got $100. If we all chip in, we could make this pretty affordable. We could buy a lighthouse. So sometimes they do come up for sale. I think that could be a pretty fun opportunity. So if you're interested in that, see me after, right? So we are now on to basically close to our lighthouse superlatives. Our northernmost light is actually up here on Isle Royale, the Rock of Ages Lighthouse. 1908, 117 feet tall, so kind of our tallest light. You can see obviously the danger it's marking there. But here's the crazy thing. Even with this light marking this danger, sometimes things like this happen. So this is the George M. Cox. It was a excursion ship that was heading up, and it sank. It was going too fast in a storm, and one night the ship flipped over, had 127 passengers. They struck some of those rocks. They started going down. Think about this for just 1 second. If you are the keeper here at the Rock of Ages light, probably the scariest thing I could think of to happen is to have someone knock on your door. So that ship goes down, they get everyone in the lifeboats, and they row over to Rock of Ages, and they send up like the first officer to go up and be like, boom, boom, boom. Hi, there's 130 of us. Can we come in? Like, we're out in the lifeboat. Maybe you could call somebody for us. And that's exactly what happened. So they all hung out for the night. I imagine it was pretty jammed. And they eventually send out a rescue ship the next day. So kind of neat up there at Isle Royale. Our shortest lighthouse. Now, this is kind of hard to measure. Alpena Breakwater Light. It's cute, isn't it? Right? Tiny little lighthouse up in Alpena. It's 34 feet tall. All right, so it is, of course, on like sea level there, or lake level, I should say. Pretty short lighthouse. But then you have the Eagle River Light, which is actually only 24 feet tall, and it's built like right into a house. Like that looks, if you didn't see that lighthouse projection, this would just look like a normal house, right? Something that you could see anywhere. So although the actual tower height is shorter, this is like up on a cliff, so it's actually like it's 130 feet tall. So like, depends on what you want to measure. Which one's shorter? I don't know, but I do have a clear winner for you guys. It's one of my other favorite lighthouses. This is the 6 Mile Point Range front light. You can see it is very short. There's like a mobile home, and like there's the door to get in. This is one of those range lights, so again, it's the front one, and they did pay a guy in town to basically open the bottom of the door and like a grandfathered clock. You just pull the little chain, lights it, pulls the little chain, pulls it back up each night. So very, very cute, very, very short. I don't think there are any shorter than this in the state. So longest pier, we have the South Haven Lighthouse. A lot on the west side have these really, really long piers that go out. They're very famous. I told someone earlier, it's not that I don't like west side lighthouses, but I feel like everybody loves west side lighthouses, and maybe I'm just a stubborn thumblander from the knuckle that like I like the east side, but like I think some of them are overrated. So I like to talk a little bit more about the ones that people know a little bit less about. But very beautiful if you ever get a chance to go out and see any of those pier lights. So the furthest west light. So the Fort Gratiot is the earliest and furthest east. The furthest west is the Ontonagon West Pierhead Lighthouse, built in 1900. So it's one of these ones that marks the entrance to a harbor. It's not particularly tall. But believe it or not, you look at this kind of condition, this is actually at the end of a pier. So it looks like it's out in the middle of nothing, but that's how serious the storms can get up there. And this is in basically the western UP. Southernmost lighthouse in the state of Michigan, another pretty cute one. It's the Buffalo City. So this is down almost as you're coming around the bottom of Lake Michigan, kind of by Indiana and getting into Gary. You know, if we did the Lighthouses of Indiana, this would be a very short presentation because there's only one. We made a point of going to that one, getting our book stamped there. It's kind of fun. But New Buffalo City is another one we went and saw. It's very, very small. It's almost more decorative than anything else, but it's pretty nice. Point of Arcs Lighthouse. This is up in the thumb as well, 1857. It has the distinction for having the very first female lighthouse keeper. So this is a woman named Catherine Shook. Her husband Peter was the lighthouse keeper. He actually got on a boat. He said, I'm going down to Port Huron, which was a ways away, getting some supplies. That was the town. And he gets in his boat. He's never seen again. Weeks go by, he doesn't come back. Eventually someone gets up to this lighthouse, which is up in St. Helens County. They inform Catherine, and Catherine's doing the work to maintain the lighthouse, and they said, your husband never arrived in Port Huron. We think that he was lost somewhere at sea. You know, his boat swamped something, never found any sign of him, disappeared. But they asked Catherine, they said, you're doing such a good job, will you continue running the lighthouse? So she was the first woman to run a lighthouse here on the Great Lakes. So I think that's pretty cool that she was able to keep doing that, and they said she was up there as one of the top most efficient lighthouse keepers. All right, so I know we're probably a little over time. You can tell it's a subject I like. Hopefully you guys liked it. But I have one more. So we started kind of with the oldest lighthouse. I want to talk about the newest lighthouse. What do you think the most recent lighthouse in the state of Michigan? Give me a year guess. Milken Point. What year do you think it might be? Or a decade? When do you think we stopped building lighthouses? Anybody? 2006. You're right. See me, you can polish the erasers after class. So yes, it's 2006. It's the Wawadam Lighthouse in St. Ignace, which is really cool. So this was actually a decorative lighthouse, but they installed this in St. Ignace, and when they were dismantling it, they were getting rid of it. It was kind of elsewhere in the city. The city of St. Ignace said, wait, no, can we actually put a light up in it, and we'll mark it, and it got put on all of the aids to navigation maps. So it is an officially recognized one that appears on sailors' charts. So pretty amazing to think in this century we've had new lighthouses in Michigan. So I think that's pretty cool. So there we have it, kind of a whirlwind tour of lighthouses, lighthouse technology. I hope nobody missed a hot date. Unfortunately, they turned the lights off where the clock is. So I have no idea exactly how long it was. But if you did enjoy this, I do have other talks. I always love talking here. I know I've given many of these for Livonia before. You can always talk to your local librarian. I'm always happy to come back. And you guys can always come visit me up in Port Huron. Our site's open in April. You can come see and tour the Fort Gratiot Light. You can come tour the Huron Lightship. So you can mark off 2. We've got passport stamps for both of them. Who here has a passport? You know what I'm talking about? Yeah. So the Lighthouse Passport program is very popular. If you don't have one, we can hook you up with that too. But yeah, I hope you, did everybody learn something? Yeah. Right? A little something? Then I think we can say mission accomplished, right?